Okay, I think we're going to get started. So, first of all, to our attendees, thank you for joining us today. We're grateful. We hope this will be useful. Um, we are going to do quick intros to the four of us on the panel. Then we're going to provide quick introductions to the organizations, and then go through two different series where we're going to talk about InsideTrack's journey on developing data-driven measurement for management dashboards, and then data-driven management for evaluation. And then we're going to save time at the end for questions from the audience. Please do know that we will be sharing recordings and the PowerPoint after this webinar. So first, maybe we could go around real quick and have everyone introduce themselves. I can start. My name is Alex Cortez. I'm a partner at Bellwether.
My name's Melissa Steele King, and I'm a senior partner at Bellwether and the lead of the evaluation team.
And I'm Ruth Bauer, president of InsideTrack.
Hi, everybody. I'm Megan Joyce, Vice President of Solutions at InsideTrack.
Great. Thank you all. Just to give a little more context about both organizations, I'm going to lead off with Bellwether. So Bellwether is a nonprofit. We envision a future where all young people have access to an excellent education and live lives filled with opportunity. We provide support in strategic planning, academic and program design, policy analysis and development, measurement and evaluation, which is what brings us here today, and research and field building publications. We work in early childhood, K-12, post-secondary, and workforce, and work with a range of organizations from district charter, parochial and private schools who are serving underserved communities, to nonprofit program providers and intermediaries, philanthropies, research and advocacy institutions, institutions of higher education, and local, state, and federal government. And now I'll introduce my InsideTrack friends.
Hello, everyone. At InsideTrack, our mission is all about equitable social mobility through the power of coaching. And as a first-generation college student myself, I know how challenging it can be to be on a higher ed campus and navigate those systems that can be quite complex. And so we believe that coaching can play a really critical role in ensuring that students get the help that they need when they need it so that they can have the outcomes that they desire. Go to the next slide. And we do this all through the power of coaching. And coaching is based on these 5 elements, starting with building relationships and that trust that you build with the student, assessing what is happening in that student's life, and then making sure we're breaking down big problems into smaller problems so that we can set goals and advance to the next step. And then, of course, being that cheerleader, that person in your corner, and then strategizing around what is next as well. And then we have these 3 categories called knowledge, skills, and belief to ensure that students have the knowledge they need to be successful, that they have the skills that they need, and probably most importantly, the beliefs. We know in higher ed, one of the big challenges is a sense of belonging. That's one of the main reasons folks stop out of school is that they don't feel like they belong. They don't feel that connection. And so really making sure that a student has strong knowledge, skills, and beliefs ensures that they're on the path to success. Next slide. Oh no, my little pretty thing. That's okay. Just go to the next one, Melissa. Yeah, this was an animated graphic of this wonderful slide here, which just really shows that we have 3 areas that we look at in terms of the impact that we have as an organization. And this is based on the work that Alex and Bellwether did on the Pragmatic Playbook for Impact that I would encourage you all to review and read. It really helped us frame how we were looking at our impact. So the direct work that we do with students every day, reaching out one-on-one, having those coaching sessions. And then our widespread impact, which is a train the trainer model, where we are working with schools and with institutions to train their staff members on our coaching methodology. And then lastly, the systemic impact. So being able to take those insights that we've learned, raise the voice of the learner, and change the things that are really systemically causing challenges for students. And it can be anything from a policy out of school to working with the local state government and influencing how those things really are set up to ensure student success. And I think that is my intro of InsideTrack. We're a national organization. We serve over 140 partners and have really appreciated our partnership with Bellwether to help us fine-tune our work.
Thank you, Ruth. So what we wanted to do next is just give a quick introduction to how we think about data-driven decision making. And Melissa, over to you.
Yeah. So a lot of organizations set out to engage in data-driven decision making, but we want to acknowledge that it is not always simple, and there are obstacles that you can run into in the process. Um, Starting from just that people can disagree about data, about what data to measure, about how to measure that data. Once you have figured that out, actually capturing the data is not always easy. It has a cost to it. You need to invest in the resources to collect the data, and it also can be challenging to figure out how to connect your program's activities with the actual outcomes you're seeing. And then once all of that is figured out and you're at the stage of reporting results, that also has consequences. So data is rational, system change is political, and that can have implications as you put results out there. Um, Measuring and reporting data can win friends and make enemies, and it can both feel high stakes and it can actually be high stakes, depending on the situation. So ultimately, the measurement and reporting of data is an act of power, and that's why sometimes the process can feel fraught. Uh, but even with all of those, we acknowledge that there is a lot of value to being data driven. So organizations that use data well for decision making um, are better able to plan, set priorities, properly resource those priorities. They have the information to manage and maximize the execution impact of their programs. Um, they are able to learn about what works for whom and what does not work in order, again, to best deploy investments and resources. And finally, there is capturing data allows organizations to demonstrate their impact to key partners, to allies, to funders, and also to help inform and shape the broader field and the policy environment. So all of these benefits make it well worth finding a way around the challenges to build a data-driven organization.
Thank you, Melissa. And there are many ways to think about a data-driven cycle. This is just, again, one of many, but one that we sometimes find useful is to think about how organizations truly unlock the power of data have to build their capacity in four areas. The first is the what of data. So really developing the right data with agreement on method for collecting, where the details really matter, the right format for ease of understanding and for running sensitivities and scenarios and dashboards, the right timing and frequency. And so it's sort of foundational to start with a what of data. But then organizations need to build their capacity to go from the what to the so what of analysis. Who are the right people to come together at the right time to analyze the data, to make meaning of it, to identify root causes of good performance or performance in need of improvement or strong hypotheses? And then the third piece is going from the so what to the now what. For organizations taking their insights, developing options, having a clear process for making decisions, actually making those decisions, and then communicating those decisions. And then the last part of the cycle is going from the now what to the what happens, and turning a decision into a plan of action where there are the conditions as well as the expectations that ensure successful execution. And all of this is within the context of an organization that has a culture that prioritizes being data-driven and transparent. Now, for our webinar today, we are going to focus on this first piece around data and dashboards, the what of data, and the journey that we see orgs taking, in particular, the journey InsideTrack took around this, both for management dashboards and for evaluation. To go a little deeper and to add yet another consulting framework, within the what of data, we see value in helping organizations think about breaking data into the following three categories. There's beneficiary performance, there's operational performance, and financial performance. And to Melissa's point about measurement and data being hard, we realize it is daunting for some orgs to have good data in all three of these categories and then combine them together. But we also see that it can unlock real value for organizations. So, for example, on the internal planning and management, being able to combine data across these three areas helps organizations understand what programming is or is not creating value or different levels of value for different beneficiaries. It helps them understand the true resource requirements to execute, be it money or talent, but also time, systems, and partnerships. So, for instance, if your program is a tutoring program that is expecting 40 hours of tutoring, that's your operational model, but performance is students are only getting 20 hours. One, that could have implications on beneficiary performance. Maybe students aren't doing as well. On the other hand, it's really interesting to learn if a certain subset of your population is doing perfectly fine with 20 hours of tutoring versus a target of 40. And of course, 40 versus 20 has big implications on your financial performance. And it allows you to then think about what are the trade-offs between financial and beneficiary in terms of how many people you're able to serve. And usually it's more nuanced because whoever you're serving isn't a single unitary community, but has subsegments. This then allows organizations to think about innovating and piloting new program design variations and to make trade-off in who an organization serves and its growth and pace of growth. On the external side, it allows organizations to think about right-sizing fundraising and or contract pricing so that organizations are not underbidding based on their true cost, but also being competitive. It helps articulate expectations to partners about what their non-negotiables are, but also very importantly, where there's room and need for them to be flexible and customizable to local context. It helps communicate results and impact. And then to Melissa's point around systemic impact, when thinking about more ambitious adoption of systems embracing your program, understanding what program works, what the evidence is, what the true cost is, helps you more target what it is around policy and funding that you're trying to accomplish.
So, as Alex is saying, we're focusing today on the task of defining what data to collect. And what data you collect is going to be informed by your purpose. And we're going to talk today about two ways that organizations can capture and use data for decision making. That would be data for management and data for evaluation, both of which are mutually reinforcing. So an organization may be focused on capturing and using data as a management tool, which can look like creating a dashboard to monitor those areas of performance that Alex just went over, the beneficiary, operational, and financial performance, and using that data to inform decision making as a leader and maximize the performance of the organization. On another hand, the data you may be thinking about using data for evaluation, using it to understand what is working for whom and under what conditions, and to provide the evidence of efficacy of the program model. For both of those, you'd be drawing on a set of information about beneficiary operational and financial performance and using it in slightly different ways. But each of those also informs the other. So as you collect data for management, you develop a core base of data that you can then use in generating research questions for evaluation. And similarly, the insights and the evidence that are created through the evaluation then inform fundamental management decisions. So today we're going to talk about how we worked with InsideTrack to improve its use of data for both management and evaluation. So both of those purposes was very useful to do both of those in a short amount of time because they really inform each other. And in both use cases, we're going to share with you a broad four-step process that we walked through for each of these projects, the management focused and evaluation focused projects. The first step is generally to define the ideal state of the data. So thinking about what is it that you wish you were able to know? What data do you already collect that you can get started with right away? And moving to step C, organizing that data and beginning to use it. And then finally, creating a roadmap to add data over time to advance closer to that ideal state that you've already defined. And so in our next slide, we're going to give an overview of how we work together with InsideTrack through this process for each purpose.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. So, as we mentioned in the beginning, we're breaking this up into two parts. First, InsideTrack's journey around dashboards, and then InsideTrack's journey around evaluation. And so I'm going to give a quick intro of the process and then really open it up to Ruth and Megan to talk about their experiences. So to start us off, like what do we mean by dashboards? And so some thoughts about what makes a good dashboard or dashboards. They really are about providing data that's important to drive insights and then decisions. Like data doesn't exist for the sake of data. It exists for the sake of different audiences being able to make decisions that drive performance. Um, Dashboards are shared with the right frequency to be actionable, but balanced with when data becomes available. And of course, when data is available and when you might want it is never quite perfect. And so there's a balance. Dashboards are visually accessible. And they segment data as needed, be program and business line or beneficiaries or geographies or partners types, to be able to go into richer analysis to develop insights and decisions. And then they exist to be able to run sensitivities. And one thing that we think is really important for organizations in thinking about their dashboard journey is that you may have different dashboards for different audiences. And so, for example, your board, you may present to them a very sort of small subset of the ultimate outcomes that you really care about. As a leadership team, you may look at the next set of detail that is driving performance to those ultimate outcomes. And then, of course, a team may be looking at more tactical data because they are able to touch and influence things on a much more ongoing basis. But again, all of it's aligned to a set of outcomes. So dashboards for different audiences should still be able to tell a common story. So to Melissa's point, when we engaged on this journey with InsideTrack around developing management dashboards, we followed this four-step process. So again, the first step is define the ideal state. What is it that in an ideal world, InsideTrack's executive team would want in order to manage performance and drive impact? Then against that ideal state, step B is we actually look at the cold hard reality of what data actually exists, what data doesn't exist but may be easy to capture. And through that, we created a version 1.0 of a set of dashboards in step C, where we take the existing data, we begin to use it, but also recognizing there were sets of data that the organization wanted for the long term that it needed to develop a roadmap to go and get. And this is where dashboards should be iterative and evolving over time. So very quickly to walk through these steps in more detail. Initially, we worked with a blank slate and crowdsourced with InsideTrack's executive team, and then also a set of managers running programs, a list of 114 aspirational impact measures. We then had people rank which ones they thought were most important. And then to that step B, we started to crosswalk, well, what data does InsideTrack have now? What does it not have that it is a priority that we think we can get pretty easily versus, and with, relatively low data effort versus the stuff that's going to take time and resources to collect. Then to step C, we developed initial management dashboards. We started with Excel, and then the idea was to build these into Tableau. People can use any different number of software programs. And some of the things that we thought were really strong about the InsideTrack structure of dashboards was one, in Tableau, once it eventually got there, even if it started in Excel, there was a way to be able to pull down and look at the overall organization and then different partner sites. They were very clear on last year's actual performance as a starting point for considering next year's performance. They then set targets for the coming year, and not every measure is going to have a target. Some measures don't have targets, but an organization wants to know. Some need to have a baseline year or two to figure out what the target could be. And some measures an organization is pretty comfortable with and wants to set performance targets. And then over time, the organization was able to measure a set of things quarterly. And so at each quarter, the management team was able to pull up, look at the data, go through that process of the what of data to the so what of insights to the now what of decisions to the what happens of action, and see data cumulative over time. And then the organization also wanted to think about really understanding performance by high priority groups so that it could see what the performance was overall, but then differentiated to really understand where there was strong performance, where there was disparities in performance, and all of that as a starting point in service of, so now that we know this, what can we do with it to drive impact? And then last, we worked with InsideTrack to create a roadmap. And sort of over 18 months, we had sort of the staged phase one implementation of the version 1.0 of dashboards, like you saw on the prior page, while recognizing there were a set of things that were going to take longer to collect. And so we laid out a roadmap for that. And of course, this was subject to reality unfolding. And as we'll talk about when we get to Melissa's conversation on evaluation, these started to merge together. But that was sort of the four steps in a nutshell. And I went through that quickly because what I really want to do is spend time in discussion with InsideTrack. And so I'd love for you guys to start off by just sharing what were some of the biggest obstacles or like biggest opportunities that led you to go, we want to up our dashboard game.
Yeah, I can jump in on that and just say that we had a lot of data out there in our company that was used in different ways, but there was no bringing it all together and no focus on what we should be looking at and why it mattered and what was important. And so I think we knew we had this like opportunity to streamline this and make it more effective and make it have more of an impact on the work that we did versus just individuals looking at random data. But figuring out how to get there and how to make that happen, Bellwether was really key in coming in to bring us together and putting a process in place so that we could get the most out of the data that we had.
I'm curious, you guys are in the process of sort of beginning to use version 1.0. How have the dashboards proved useful to InsideTrack so far? And where have there been learnings about if we could do this again, this might be how we did something differently?
Yeah, well, one of the things that was super helpful about the process was identifying the things we really wanted but didn't have yet. The data
Mm.
points that came up as very important across the organization, but we didn't have them, and to put a plan in place to get them. Now we don't even have them all today. Still, we're still working on that journey, right? But just acknowledgement that that was an important piece of data for our work and getting everybody aligned on that, just that itself really helped us understand, why it mattered and why the effort was worth it to, explore different ways to get that data. So I think the dashboards have helped us just really have alignment across the org. And then also being able to have just a place where we know we can go to get the information. I mean, we used to, I would like pull up 5 different spreadsheets and call 3 people, to try to find a piece of information I was looking for. And now it's all very easily accessible by leadership, by team leads, so that everyone has access to that information.
I'm curious, is there any particular examples that stood out of like, we didn't have this before, or we had it, but to your point, it was in 9 different places and we had to cut and paste that have really helped the team go, all right, now we have this, we can run with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are just some of the information around program results. So like one of the things that we track is like student retention term over term or year over year. And that existed, and we could get that on a team. I would have to go to the team themselves, right, to get that information. But now being able to look at that, like you mentioned in your overview, the little drop down, where you can like do the drop down and look at something in aggregate or look at it at a specific partner and see that information, and it's really easy to do. That was a huge improvement.
Right. One of the things that we see often in all types of projects is really this tension and trade-off between efficiency and community. Wanting to be as inclusive as possible, but also knowing that takes time, including the time of the people who are being asked. And yet it gives you a richer context by which to approach any decision. Can you talk more about how you sort of thought about inclusivity as part of this dashboard design process? Because I think we found that very interesting and refreshing.
Yeah, I'll share a little from my perspective, and then Megan, invite you to jump in on particularly Megan manages a lot of our technical team as well. And so, I think this is where the Bellwether process was super valuable to us because in the past, I think when we've done things like this was like the leadership team wants X, Y, and Z, and we're going to put a spreadsheet together and track these numbers, right? But this wasn't about what the leadership team wanted. This was about what the organization felt was valuable. And so we involved folks from all across the org, whether it was from our analytics team to our coaches to our managers who were managing our partnerships, folks from all across the org to say what is important to track, and then how are we going to get the information that we don't have and really come together. And that was probably the most powerful part of this whole process, was just having all those voices be part of what we ultimately track and what we care about as an org. Megan, I don't know if you want to jump in and share a little there.
Yeah, what I would add is I think partnering with Bellwether led us to get as many voices to the table as early as possible. eventually you have to get to the point where you're making a decision or you're prioritizing, right? But what we were able to do by including more folks early on was have more options, right? Like not just limit the perspective to the folks sitting on the leadership team, the executive team. So as we were able to get down to the point where we had to prioritize, which we did, we were able to look at all of those elements that folks were asking for and recommending and asking ourselves, what are we going to learn from this data point and where does it fall in this order of prioritization?
Great, thank you all. And we're going to turn to your journey on evaluation in a couple of minutes, but sort of one last question on this, which is, as lots of other organizations are thinking about their journey around being data-driven, some are very sophisticated, some are in an early stage. What is your advice to others about how to build out a dashboard strategy?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I think the first question or the first advice I have is get help, to get somebody to come in like Bellwether and help you with the process. I think it just helps to have outside eyes. The other thing I would say is start starting with that long-term vision, I think was really important because it gave us something to be inspired by. And even though it's aspirational, right? There are parts of it we still don't have today. It is important to have that vision in mind so that as you're doing the work to achieve that vision, you know why, and it's worth the effort and worth the work that you're doing. So I think that was just a really important part of starting there was a really important part of the process for us, and the number one piece of advice I would give.
Great. Just because we're good on time, I might take one question that I saw in the chat about both quantitative and qualitative data. If you guys can say a little more about how that was integrated into your dashboards.
Yeah, we definitely had more quantitative than qualitative, but we have a mix of both. And I think we use a lot of the quantitative data to tell us where there's a story that we could pull out the qualitative, and we do a lot of storytelling and sharing, the impact that we're having in that more narrative way that I think is super important. On the dashboard, it was more about like indicating where the qualitative data would be important to dig into.
Great. Well, one encouragement to the audience, please continue to submit questions because we'll have plenty of time at the end. And with that, we're going to transition from data-driven decision-making around management dashboards to around evaluation. And I'm going to turn it back to my friend and colleague, Melissa.
Great. Thanks, Alex. So yes, I'm going to talk about our journey around creating and improving the evaluation efforts of InsideTrack. And we focused on this one we focused in this part on InsideTrack's coaching program. So if folks missed the beginning, the intro around what InsideTrack does, this particular program coaches work with students in higher education to help coach them through success to achieve their goals. And they're at different higher ed institutions around the country. And so we started by identifying the purpose of the evaluation, because there's many purposes of eval. And for this, we just really started with building out the systems for monitoring outcomes for the participants in the coaching program, because InsideTrack at the time wanted to lay the foundation for building a more rigorous evaluation strategy later. And so this is really just building the basic systems. And you can go to the next slide. So again, as we went through this broad process tailored more to building an evaluation plan. So for this project, we started with really doing a lot of work in step A, defining the theory of action, the logic model, the research questions, and the intended impact, because all of those foundational concepts really define what it is that we need to know that will anchor our evaluation plan. So we spent a lot of time with step A. Then we crosswalked to the current state of data. What are they already collecting that could be used for the evaluation purposes? And in step C, we helped use that existing data and the aspirational data to develop a more comprehensive evaluation plan. That's a plan for collecting and analyzing the data over time. And finally, the final step again is the roadmap. So, yep, you can go ahead. Yeah, so starting with the first step, defining the ideal state, we worked on an intended impact statement that articulated the who, what, and so what of what the coaching and program is intended to do. This statement guides what we ultimately need to measure. And once we define the intended impact statement, you can go to the next slide. We then defined a logic model explaining how the program components lead to that intended impact and evaluation questions aligned to each component of the logic model. So, what do we want to know about the implementation of the program components? What do we want to know about short-term outcomes? And what is it we want to know about the impact? And finally, in this foundational building out the ideal state, on the next slide, we also agreed to focus on a priority set of program outcomes. So Ruth mentioned in the beginning that there are some key knowledge, skills, and beliefs that the program is designed to help to lead participants towards. Those are called KSBs for short, knowledge, skills, and beliefs. And we decided to focus on figuring out what data is needed to measure and assess growth on those KSBs. So then we move to looking at what existing data can be used for measuring this. And we knew that InsideTrack was already using a survey with learners. We wanted to make the burden light on both coaches and especially the learners. And so we determined that we could actually sort of build out a suite of surveys where learners would take an entry survey and an exit survey that had a slightly more comprehensive set of questions about knowledge, skills, and beliefs. And in between, we built in touch points where coaches would document what they're seeing about growth in knowledge and skills. Harder to document other people's beliefs because you're not inside their heads, so that we just asked from the learners themselves. And then also as part of step B on the next slide, we also built out a question bank for each of those surveys. So starting from their existing survey, we just articulated a little bit further to make sure all the surveys in the suite were well aligned. And then we moved to the third step, which is organizing the data. And this is really sort of the meat of building the evaluation plan. We organized for each of the knowledge, skills, and beliefs. This is just a sample right here. We articulated what was the desired outcome aligned to that knowledge, skill, or belief. What were the specific indicators that InsideTrack would be looking at? And what was the data source? We also, it's not pictured here, but we also articulated a timeline for collecting the data. And so this is the one source of truth about what data needs to be collected and how it will be analyzed and reported to understand whether the intended outcomes are being achieved. And then we moved on to integrating that into the roadmap. So the plans for the launching and piloting the new surveys were built into this same roadmap that you saw before with the dashboards, because the information from these surveys is going to feed into the dashboards. And so that's all the green arrows at the bottom are about developing the surveys, rolling them out, and integrating them into dashboards. So that's a broad overview of the evaluation work and how it was a little bit different from how we approached the dashboard work. But I would love to take some time now, again, to hear from InsideTrack about the process from your side. So I'd love to know a little bit about what your key lessons were as a team from this exercise in developing the evaluation plan. What was easy or what was hard, and why?
Sure, I'll jump in. Thanks, Melissa. One key lesson for us through the process has probably, I would say the top lesson has been clarity of goals and outcomes. So the process of creating a strong evaluation plan really clarified what our coaching aims to develop or do. So the exercise led by Bellwether really forced us to sit down as an organization and collectively identify and align on exactly what we want learners to be able to know, think, and do as a result of our coaching work, and then align those KSBs, those knowledge, skills, and beliefs with our work. A couple other things that come to mind. I definitely learned that measuring mindset shifts is harder than measuring most things, but so important. And then a reminder that ownership and buy-in really matter across the organization. In terms of what was easy, I would say identifying what we wanted learners to be able to know, think, and do is a conversation we've been having for a long time. So we had a lot of groundwork to work from. What's harder, and I think we'll really be paying a lot of attention to and learning more over the upcoming months, is figuring out ways to measure these constructs, these KSBs, in ways that aren't invasive or disruptive to the coaching program or the coaching relationship, because that relationship is so central to our impact and our model.
And can you say a little bit more, Megan, about the implementation? So,
Yeah.
having done this work and now starting to roll it out, what are you learning about in the implementation? What are the challenges and what are the benefits?
Absolutely. Yeah. First, I'll say that we approached this project, this initiative, as a transformational change and not just a technical project. So for InsideTrack, that means we're using a change management approach to implement the evaluation and ensure the changes are clearly connected to InsideTrack's organizational goals and communicated out to the organization. All of that helps us just build trust and buy-in and allows space for iteration and feedback throughout the organization. It also ensures the plan is sustainable and eventually widely adopted. We're not there yet. After wrapping with Bellwether, though, our specific steps that we took included identifying a core project team with members across the organization with a focus on deepening engagement and buy-in with the initiative and really getting that feedback in order to iterate and improve on some of the details of the implementation and the decisions that we had made. We have built out some, but not all of the technical capabilities needed to scale. So we're doing a lot of survey automation, things like that, in order to make the lift for our coaches and our managers as light as possible. And then we've developed a pilot in partnership with the project team that I mentioned earlier and are set up to launch that pilot in about 3 weeks. So looking forward to that.
Can I jump in just real quick, Melissa? I just wanted to add, because Megan brought up the change management piece and the importance of that. And I saw some questions in the chat that kind of related to this as well. And I just wanted to call out that I think that whenever a decision is being made that is going to result in a change for an organization, having the change management process is so important, because if all you're doing is saying, here's the data, we're making the change, then the data decision part of it becomes a negative, right? And you want to be able to use the data to support the decision that's being made, but still understand that there's that human side of change and that there's a lot that has to happen for the organization or the project to be successful. And that's what Megan has done here with this project.
That's fantastic. And what I'm hearing is that the pace has to go at the pace of change management, and maybe a little bit not as moving as fast as you might have thought initially, but that it's working for you. Yeah. What advice would you give to other organizations embarking on building out an evaluation plan for their program?
Yeah, advice I would give includes, I think something you hit on in introducing the framework, but starting with purpose. So clarifying what are the goals, and is it, just to improve your practice? Do you want to get better, in our case, at coaching? Or are you looking to better demonstrate your impact? Are you looking to support decision making? It's often going to be all of the above or a mix of those, but really being clear on that will help you identify the purpose for the evaluation itself and then make the development of those items much easier, but also much more useful. I also learned this throughout the process, and I'll share with everybody, which is focusing on meaningful outcomes. So don't just measure what's easy, measure what matters. Evaluation for us of knowledge, skills, and beliefs is pretty difficult compared to a lot of other things that we measure, like participation, satisfaction, even outputs like retention. But the outcomes are more meaningful in improving our practice and demonstrating our impact, and then ultimately in supporting decision making as well. And then I think we've hit on this with the change management discussion, but with this project as well, involving stakeholders early and often, I do think it will slow you down. And obviously, we're also asking time from folks who are incredibly busy and have competing priorities. But the insights are so helpful in ensuring that the plan is practical, it's culturally responsive, and aligned with the work happening, that we're not making too many assumptions or moving too quickly. And then the very last thing that I'll say, and probably my biggest lesson in working with both our director of research as well as Bellwether over the past couple of years, is linking evaluation to action. I've learned that an evaluation plan should lead to data that can be used to improve your work. So making it more routine to ask what are we learning from these data and how can we adjust accordingly has been really important for me and I think for our organization.
I love that, Megan. And I want to move to inviting questions or addressing questions from the audience in a minute. So if you have questions, please add them to the Q&A box, and we can address them in a second. But to your last point, I would ask both of you, Megan and Ruth, about the process of doing both the evaluation focused work and the dashboard focused work at the same time. And we talked earlier about how those data for management and data for evaluation can inform each other. So I'm wondering if you had, and you did all of that in the course of, I don't know, maybe 8 months. So I'm wondering if you have any insights about or learning from working on both of those fronts, the evaluation and management front with data, either lessons learned or ways that that was helpful or challenging.
Well, one thing I will say is that I feel like the coming together of everyone on the dashboards and identifying what we wanted to track also told us where we had holes, and some of those holes could be answered through evaluations. Right. So there was even though I think both Megan and I would say neither one of these projects have we moved forward as quickly as we would have liked, and gotten as far as we would have liked, but we keep progress is what matters, right? It's like the baby steps, it's taking the steps forward. And evaluations can be complex, and so you can't do them all at once either, and they build on each other. But understanding that we had some gaps and that the evaluation could help us fill those was also an incentive to move that forward.
I would also add, going through the process on measuring data for management purposes helped me see that we really did have a gap with the evaluation, that we had a lot of metrics to measure a lot of things, but we weren't measuring the impact on the learner from a knowledge, skills, and beliefs perspective. We're measuring a lot of other things about the learner. But that was a gap, and I think we knew that and we wanted to move forward, but that first process really helped me understand the urgency and priority of the second project.
Really helpful. Thank you. Thank you both. So I want to move to then just opening up for questions and discussion across both of these sort of different projects that we've worked on. And again, encourage folks to add questions in the Q&A. I'm going to start with this question from Todd. Thank you. I'm going to read it to you, read it out loud. So many K-12 district leaders don't have experience using data to manage or make decisions, nor do their boards or bosses insist on it. So there's very little metric-based accountability, at least in some places. So if the executives don't see lack of data tools as a problem, they may struggle to see why it would be useful. So what would you do with that? How would you address if you have stakeholders who aren't seeing the usefulness?
Yeah, I probably would not start with a dashboard, but I do think starting with a problem or an issue that that leader wants to see solved and has is in on, with you, and then telling your story, starting at the top level of like what is happening around in the landscape, what is happening at the highest level with the problem that you're trying to solve. And then going to the next level and say, what data do you have that supports this? Whether that's that a change should be made or shouldn't be made or whatever you have, like what data can you pull and show? And then share the narrative, like what is the story that comes from all of that? And how do you then put the human side into whatever recommendation that is being made? And I think that, because leaders, that don't have familiarity or access to this, if you're just showing them a bunch of numbers, it just becomes overwhelming. But if you can embed those numbers in the story that you're trying to tell, then over time, that becomes a much more comfortable way to look at what needs to happen and is your backup to your recommendation.
I can
And
add, oh, go ahead, Alex.
no, Megan, you first, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, in my experience, bringing it back to, for InsideTrack, at least the mission in this example, perhaps like, why are we all here? Why do we do this work? The students, the learners, the world. I think the more you can bring it back to the why, whether it's for the org, the institution, or the individual, the less scary looking at data can feel, if you know that it is giving you the information you need to move your mission and your objective forward.
Yeah, and I'd love to build on Ruth and Megan's point, which is at some level fundamentally does start with the question of values. Does a leader and the organization value data? And that's, many organizations are impact driven, but that's not the same as being data driven. And that means being willing to capture the data, share it, make meaning of it, but also live with the consequences of when things are performing well and when they're not. So I think that, like, do you value data is really important. Then I think a leader can model it. And then I do think coming back to that data-driven cycle of the what of data, the so what of insights, and now what of decisions and what happens of action, those are each a set of skills to build in an organization. And so, for instance, in another lifetime, I worked for a large charter network. We had 22 schools, 13,000 kids that we served in one city. And we took the journey on this. And it was almost a 2-year journey to, like InsideTrack, establish dashboards, pilot them, get good at them, but really make sure that they were aligned from the board down to the level of individual teachers and classrooms. And so we did trainings on how to do the so what of root cause analysis. We did training on decisions. We did work plan training. But very importantly, the superintendent had a very effective way to model that data was important to her. She would print up the dashboards. There were 8 dashboards per school in a binder, and she'd spend 2 days a week visiting the schools. And in the ride over to the school, she would look at their data and think about what she thought it meant, what she thought they might do because of it. And when she showed up, she expected those leaders to have looked at the data, said, this is what we think it means. Here's what we think we're going to do in reaction to it. And very quickly, that set a mode and modeling of, if you hadn't looked at the data and your boss or your boss's boss showed up with the data asking questions, that was going to put you in an awkward spot. I would also just say one thing that as the organization got more, or this charter district got more comfortable with data, is that one thing we don't always talk about a lot, but data actually, it is high stakes, but data also builds emotional safety. Because one of the things that we had as a challenge in this charter district, we hadn't set targets. So no one was quite sure what good was. Like, we knew certain numbers being higher were better, a couple numbers being lower were better, but we started to set targets, and very quickly I heard from the teachers, no, we want you to set targets and other things because we want to know what success looks like for us as a social contract. And again, that takes time. It means building that data mindset, and shifting that culture and building those skills across the organization. But when everyone starts to norm on it, it really does become that social contract for people.
That's great. Thank you, Alex. I'm going to add the one of the other questions in the chat. I'm going to jump to because I think it is relevant as we're talking about building buy-in. The question about funders wanting to see positive results from awards given to organizations and how you handle the narrative with them. And I'll just say before turning over to you, Ruth and Megan, that to Alex's point, if there are any funders on the call, one of the things we do talk about when we do this kind of work with funders is thinking about how to engage the grantees in deciding what the performance measures for the whole grant portfolio should be. I mean, obviously, organizations decide on their own measures, but also thinking about measuring the success of a whole grant portfolio can be done in a more inclusive manner. So that is one way to think about shifting a mindset about power in evaluation. But Ruth and Megan, I'd invite you to talk about how you think about handling the narrative with funders.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I would say the number one thing that we've learned over the years in working with funders is they're just as interested in what has worked and successful as what didn't work and the lessons that you've learned. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind. I'll just give an example from real life InsideTrack, which is that we do a lot of work with students who have stopped out of higher education and bringing them back. We call that our re-enrollment work. And with the schools that we work with, we will have huge success with schools that give us student, contact information that is current and, good email, good phone number, all of that, and on time, in the spring, plenty of time before fall enrollment. And then we have schools that do the same work with us, but they're late to the engagement. Their data's not clean. We have a lot of bad emails, and the results are not as good. And so being able to share the data, the same data on both of those engagements, and one's going to have really positive results and one's going to have not so positive results. But being able to say why is almost as important as the results themselves, right? Because those funders want to see like, okay, here's, the schools, here's what we need to ask of the schools before we even get started. How do we engage people at the right time and set the right expectations? And it just helps set up for success future programs. And we've really found that discussion and collaboration with funders is what's so important. And so then the data is less scary because you're sharing what you have, but you're also sharing what worked and what didn't work.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would add that what we've seen as we've worked with organizations to this about this is, at least on the evaluation side, I mentioned that we do a lot of work in the beginning to define the logic model, the intended impact. We also talk a lot about what's within an organization's sphere of control to impact and what is outside of their direct sphere of control. And so having that clearly articulated can also help with messaging to funders. Because if you're an organization that's several steps removed from students and the funders are pushing to see student outcomes, it may give you language to say, well, what we actually have impact over is training these institutions to train coaches who then work with students. So that can be a helpful communication tool, at least in my experience. Um, I believe we had a question about AI. How do you see AI being used or incorporated into this? I think this means AI being used or incorporated into this arena in the next 6 months to a year. Um, Ruth and Megan, do you have any thoughts on that? Have you started playing around with that?
Yeah, I can jump in. And this is, I'll speak first to how Inside Track is thinking about it today and then try to answer your question around more broadly. I don't know that I have a great answer, but I'll give you my perspective. Right now, Inside Track is focused on leveraging AI to be better at collecting data, specifically collecting insights. So as we're engaging with learners through various channels, a lot of scheduled phone interactions, email, SMS, and, it's not like it was 20 years ago where we have that scheduled meeting. There's one interaction and a set of notes that you can pull from. It's kind of like all of us communicating with each other, different channels throughout the day, throughout the week, checking in depending on when you have time, space, and what's going on in your life. So what we're trying to do right now is mine that data as best we can in order to take some of the burden of pulling those insights out from the coaching team, and that part we're pretty far along on. So that's really just generative AI summarizing something like coach notes. What we're working on that isn't quite live yet with our coaches is then taking that and helping us identify things like what Inside Track calls focus areas. So these are what was the focus of our coaching engagement or interaction today, or what were a couple things that we covered today for reporting back, both to our client partners, to our funders, but also just to the higher ed workforce space in general, in order to share what we're seeing and what we're hearing, because we do engage with a lot of learners in a lot of different institution types over the course of a year. So we want to make sure we're getting that out. So that has really been our focus. There's obviously a lot more that can be done. I think my limited experience with this over the past couple of years has been putting the coach, in our case, at the center of that experience has been really positive, allowing them to leverage the tool and also make a judgment call. Our next step that we'll take after the focus areas will be having a next step generated, a recommended next step following a coaching interaction. But ultimately, it's still up to that coach to decide, do I want to send that resource to the learner, or am I going to hold on that because I know something about what's happening in their life that tells me this isn't the right time for that action? So our perspective has been putting the human at the center, the coach at the center as much as possible. And that seems to be resonating out there, but I know a lot of folks are having varying experiences.
I want to be sensitive to time and answer one last question, then we'll wrap up. And Heather, to your question in the chat, we'll see if this answers it directly or not. One thing we haven't talked a lot about is, well, what happens when you're an organization or a constellation of organizations like a funder and a set of grantees who are now collecting lots and lots of data? And I think it is important, again, in the spirit of, to Melissa's earlier point, data is an active power, but it's also a social contract, to sometimes pull up and ask, like, is this working? Is this the right data? Because there are times we work with organizations, and when you really get people talking and honest, you find out that everyone is doing something that nobody actually wants to do. And that is absolutely true sometimes of collecting and reporting certain data. So it is important to periodically sort of pull up. I think related to that, though, is where are people willing in that social contract to norm on very tactical things like how to measure? So I'd shared that earlier example of a charter network. When we wanted to measure ACT scores, we collected data from our 3 high schools, and we immediately found one was reporting the ACT score from their junior year test. One was reporting the best of up to 5 takes of the ACT, and one actually had its strongest students in ACT, and students who were struggling more took the SAT. So those are 3 completely different ways to capture and calculate that one simple number. And so we had to go back and have a discussion across them about how we can normalize. And so I think that is also, and funders have things that are important to them, and I think that's important to acknowledge, even as it can be a dialogue with their grantees. But getting into that level of detail sometimes can be really, really important to make sure data is actually communicating as a common language. With that, amazingly, we are at time. So in terms of just, wrap up, first, thank you all for joining us, either, over a late lunch or a very, very late breakfast if you're on the West Coast. The webinar and slides will be posted early next week. We're going to put into the chat just a brief 4-question survey. It should take under 2 minutes if you have a chance to fill it out. Hopefully it will appear in the chat in just a second. If you have questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to either Melissa and I at Bellwether or Ruth and Megan at InsideTrack. And to a point made earlier, if there's interest in learning more about the direct, widespread, and systemic framework, we'll also drop a link to that. And actually, it features InsideTrack as one of the organizations and how they approach this work. So again, thank you for the time. Don't be strangers if you have any questions. And I hope everyone has a good rest of the day.